Excellent. Welcome, everyone, and great to see that you're able to join our second session during our day of action on the cost of living crisis. And today's all about identifying what actions funders are and can take in response to the crisis. So we know through our own research and what came out of our cost of living week in October that the situation is extremely challenging for groups who are responding to the increase in need and demand from our communities. We heard during that week that there's huge challenges around burnout of staff, to the availability of volunteers, to the cost of energy and doing their own work going through the roof. But our members also told us that they were ready to act, showing again the commitment that the funding community has to standing with our communities and London's incredible civil society, whilst also looking at the long-term structural issues that we need to address. Over half of those we surveyed earlier this autumn were already talking to their funded groups about what they needed. 44% had already made changes to what funding could be used for, and 1 in 5 had already made additional funding available, with a further 28% looking at doing so in the near future. But the other thing that came through during our cost of living week in our research was that the complexity of navigating what to do was at times overwhelming, and where to focus your resources when the need is so great was also something our members found challenging. And that's why we brought together this day of action, focusing in on what funders are already doing to respond to the crisis, what we can learn from each other, and identify the actions and opportunities for us to support London's communities. And one of the actions that funders can take right now is committing to funding staff roles at the real living wage or higher, and encouraging their grantees to become living wage employers, and also signing up to become a living wage funder themselves. We know that low pay is a significant issue in the third sector and is only likely to get worse because of this crisis. So we're really pleased to be joined by some expert speakers today. So we have Klara, who is Programme Director at Trust for London, and Andrew, who is Programme Officer from the Living Wage Foundation. And we also have Marina here from the Living Wage Foundation to help us answer questions about how you can become a living wage funder and why you should do so right now. So before we kick off, just some technical bits. If you have questions for the speakers, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you have resources or thoughts to share, you can also use the chat box, which is where we'll also be posting links to things that you might find helpful during today's session. We're also recording this for the London Funders YouTube channel, and we'll be sharing those links in the Funder 5 newsletter going out tomorrow, so that we can reach as many funders as possible. So I think that's all the technical bits out of the way. Andrew, perhaps I can come to you first for a bit of an overview of what it means to be a living wage funder and how funders can sign up.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's all right, I'm going to share my screen now for a few slides, if that's appropriate. Yeah. Okay, so hello everyone. My name's Andrew Gordon. I'm a program officer here at the Living Wage Foundation. I'm just going to speak very briefly today about the real living wage and the work we do at the Living Wage Foundation, what we're doing to tackle in-work poverty in the third sector, and essentially how at London Funders you can support us in that effort, and why we think this is something that's really worth your time in helping to tackle the cost of living crisis that we're obviously currently going through. So very briefly, at the Living Wage Foundation, what we're trying to do is support as many employers as possible to pay their workers the real living wage. This is different than the statutory minimum wage, essentially because it is linked to the cost of living. We don't worry about median wages. We don't worry about anything else like that. The one thing that we're concerned about is, are people getting paid a wage that allows them to meet that basic decent standard of living? And what we've come up with, this is through an independent commission. We say that the London real living wage is £11.95, and outside of London, it stands at £10.90 an hour. And that's a wage that can meet the cost of living, even during the crisis that we're currently going through. And our work is with employers in every sector to try and support them to pay that real living wage. Now, what does this mean for the third sector particularly is we know that there's a huge issue of low pay and in-work poverty in this sector. We know 14% of jobs, that's about 1 in 7, are paid less than that real living wage. And we know that issue is particularly gendered, that it hurts women more than men. We know that it hurts racialized groups, particularly younger people, part-time workers, and disabled workers. You can see all of these figures here. Those come from our report, All Work and No Pay, which is specifically about the third sector. And we'll share a link after. I'll share a link in the chat after this, and possibly that'll get sent. Malena, I might ask if we could send that out as well, because that report goes into real detail about the challenges around low pay in the third sector. But as you can see, this is a real and meaningful issue, and it's one that affects, as I say, 1 in 7 workers within the sector. Now, we know there's a few different drivers of that low pay. We know that most organizations in this sector want to be paying a good wage, want to support their workers, but there's specific structural reasons that mean that's really challenging. We know that the short-term nature of funding can impact on long-term financial planning. So people, for example, aren't receiving, when they don't have a long-term funding commitment, it's hard to build in, for example, pay rises that help match inflation and match the rising cost of living. We know that it's a resource-intensive fundraising cycle, and that means that often charities are kind of always having to work to bring in more funding on a short term. That means people are left on short-term contracts. We know it means in some cases they feel they have to essentially put in a lower staffing costs to achieve funding. So we know there's real pressure there because this funding isn't there, because the core funding isn't always there. They're under that pressure that doesn't allow them to ask for it and doesn't allow them to create long-term workforce investment. We know that as organizations in this sector are starting to have to provide, a lot of basic services that previously might have been provided by local or central government, that there's a shift to commissioning of services, which again means that organizations are sometimes feeling they have to put in low bids on staffing costs or, make savings on staffing costs to achieve those bids. And again, we think that's a false economy. We think, I'll talk about that in a moment, but we think that's a real issue that we're seeing for a lot of organizations in this sector. And we think what often happens is workers who have an intrinsic motivation to work in this sector, to do good through the work they do, they'll end up burning out simply because in the end, even though they want to do good, they want to work in this sector, they maybe simply cannot afford to, and they face all the challenges of low pay, all the stresses that come with that. And eventually it leads to them being unable to work in this sector. And that's a real challenge. So what are we trying to do about this at the Living Wage Foundation? So we have a network of 11,000 accredited living wage employers across the UK. Nearly 3,000 are in the third sector. And that means about 50,000 low paid workers in this sector are getting a pay rise and are getting that uplift to meet the cost of living every year. And that, especially 2,000 of those specifically in the charity sector, which is one of our fastest growing sectors. And we're now running a project called Living Wage Funders. And within that, there's a grant making capacity of over £1.9 billion a year. So what is Living Wage Funders? What we want funders to do, and what we're asking today is for you to start considering, is support the charities and organizations that you're providing funding to pay the living wage through your grant making. So that means when you're funding projects and salaries, ensuring that those funded posts are paid the living wage. That means talking to your grantees, talking to anyone you're providing funding to about the living wage, encouraging them to accredit, encouraging them to become part of the movement and ensure they're investing in their workforce. And it means looking at that longer term picture and trying to build in year-on-year living wage increases into multi-year grants, which provides that stability for workers and allows for proper workforce investment. Now, as part of accrediting with us, that means you can use the Living Wage Funder mark. That means that you'll be promoted on our website, in our directory of organizations. We often run events. We can support with press coverage, because this is really, it's something that's a real boon for your reputation as well. And then you'd also be part of our Living Wage Funders network. We're always running events. We're consistently working with the wider sector to try and bring more people into this movement. So those are the benefits of becoming a living wage funder. And it's quite a straightforward process. The first one is to become a living wage employer yourselves. That means making sure all your direct employees are paid the living wage, having a plan for contractors, supporting your grantees to become living wage employers, making sure it's in your bid information, making sure that essentially the living wage is embedded in your practice. And when grantees are coming to you, they know that's important to you, and making sure you're funding any grant funded posts at that real living wage rate. And we think this makes sense, both on a moral level, but also on a practical level. We think this is the best way for this sector to get the best results, and for you to get the best results out of those grants that you're providing, and making sure you're providing them to organizations that are able to work effectively. You can see here, this is a huge, it's a huge boon in a few ways. It improves the quality of applicants for roles. It means employees are more likely to stay around to keep their skills within the sector. It means recruitment is easier. It enhances the reputation of organizations who pay it. Generally, we think what we end up with is, as I say, it's a moral good to be paying this to make sure people can meet the cost of living, but it's also a good from everyone's perspective, because it means that the organizations you're funding are able to work more effectively to tackle the challenges that you care about when they're paying that living wage, when they're investing in their workforces. So we think there's a huge number of benefits to this. Obviously, we've got the question and answer session now, but we're always happy to hear from anyone in the sector who's interested in our work, interested in becoming a living wage funder. And we hope that together we can really help as a sector to tackle the cost of living crisis for those working within it. And here's just a little, there's my email and some of our details, and I'm sure we can pass these slides out after the event as well, in case anyone is interested in getting in touch. So that's my bit, thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's been really helpful, and lots of important points there about providing employees in the third sector with real job security and also retaining those employees. I'm going to move on to Klara now. Earlier this year, Trust for London launched a campaign together with Citizens UK to make London a real living wage city. So perhaps if I can hand over to you to talk a bit about that, and also your experience of being a living wage funder yourself.
Thank you, Marlene. And I mean, Andrew has made a very strong case as to why already. And what we know, and Trust for London has been a supporter of the living wage campaign from very early on. And we know that pay is one of the key ways how to lift people out of poverty. So for us as a foundation that focuses on tackling poverty and inequality in London, there is no question about why the real living wage should be the norm, the minimum that all workers should be paid. And we believe that no workers should be paid less than what they need to live on. And that's why living wage is so important, because its calculation is linked to the cost of living. It's not it's not an arbitrary sum, and there is a very sophisticated calculation that happens within the commission that does that. And the reason why we decided a couple of years ago to put more money behind a campaign to make London a living wage city is that we have seen a lot of success of the previous 20 years of the living wage campaign. Since it started in 2001, about 2 billion of extra wages were put into low-paid workers' pockets in London. But we also know that the job is not finished. We still have, and there was loads of numbers that Andrew has already shared, but almost 600,000 people in low pay in London are still not getting at least a London living wage. And if you look at poverty rates in London and how many people who are in poverty are actually working, and it's more than half of those in poverty in London are working. So we have a problem with wages that are not paying enough. We have a problem with employers thinking, well, actually, we don't have to pay people enough to live on. And I think as funders, we really don't have an excuse not to be part of the living wage movement. It is, we are in a sector where we work to enable others to make change in people's lives. And we can be part of the problem. If we don't pay charities, or if we don't fund charities sufficiently so that people who work in the sector can get decent wages, then we are part of the problem. So I think the challenge is really to become part of the solution. And it is not that difficult. Andrew has explained what it requires you to become a living wage funder. And we have been a living wage funder for quite a while. And we have those conversations with our grantees, and we know it is difficult to do it where you are topping up your budget from different pots of money, and one funder is willing and the other one isn't willing. So it's not an easy task, but it's an important conversation to have, and it's an important push to be pushing each other as peers, but also to push the organizations to start challenging around living wage and become living wage employers. So what we are doing now, we are trying to move from just being a living wage funder to be a bit more of a champion of the movement in our conversations with organizations that we are funding, and encourage them to become accredited. And again, the colleagues at the Living Wage Foundation, and Marina in particular, is really helpful in that. You don't have to have all the answers as a funder when organizations ask you, what does it mean? You can get all the information from the Living Wage Foundation. And the other practical thing, apart from paying living wage or funding at a level that enables to pay at least a living wage, is if you are talking to organizations about accreditation, and what that means is you can offer to cover their fees for accreditations. The accreditation for charities isn't expensive, but it is still something that funders can say, we can cover your fees as a part of our funding, to motivate and to enable organizations to do that and to go that step further. So what I would really like to see is, sort of from this week being Living Wage Week, we will then spend another 12 months working actually and putting in place actions around living wage. And I think in the context of the cost of living crisis, it's a very practical, very tangible step that can be taken that will mean the people can be lifted out of poverty, or at least they can plan their finances better.
Thank you, Klara. And yes, 100% agree with that last point there, that this is a very important and clear action funders can take. And we really hope that coming out of the Living Week, as you say, and our Day of Action, that is something that funders sign up to. So we've had a question here through the Q&A box about barriers, which is quite interesting. So they're asking, what do you think are the barriers for other funders signing up? I don't think many, if any, funders disagree. And I presume that's with the kind of the basic principle of providing the living wage. Andrew, perhaps I can come to you first. Have you, and Marina, feel free to jump in here as well. Yeah, if you've kind of, what have funders who are perhaps skeptical of signing up, what have they reported as kind of being the reason for that?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we can speak to about that, and then I might let Marina jump in because she's got a bit more experience working with specific funders. So I think in some cases, it's about understanding what it means to become a living wage funder. So as I said, the process for application, the way to become a living wage funder, it's extremely straightforward. It's something that we're happy to support you with every step of the way. And it's something that we can provide a lot of the resources for, a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the understanding. If you need to have these discussions with your grantees, for example, we can support on that. So I think there is just about knowledge and the amount of effort it takes. So we really think that, we're here to make that process as simple as possible for you, to support you in every step of the way. I think, secondly, I think sometimes it is, I think like Klara said, it feels like it can be a difficult conversation to have with grantees sometimes, to kind of have that, especially in the context of long-term projects that might have been running for some time. But I think our theme this year for Living Wage Week is more important than ever, which is to say that the cost of living is now, especially, it's what everyone's talking about. It's really the issue. It's more pressing, more difficult than ever. So I think at this point, it's just really important to, again, take that look internally and say, are we doing enough as an organization to make sure we're supporting those low-paid workers? So I think in some cases, we have people who might think, it is an issue in this sector. We know that. And I think what we need to think about as well is that longer term view that says, yeah, it can be a little, difficult. There's a bit of work to be done in the short term, but in the long term, we really think you'll reap those results. You'll see, better work from your grantees. You'll see improved results going forward. So yeah, we understand that. I think in this sector, everybody is on board with the idea, but there are still those there are those perceived barriers, and we're here to really just try and to show those barriers aren't huge, they're not insurmountable, and we're here to support every step of the way. Marina, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I completely agree with everything Andrew just mentioned. I would add to this that from conversations that we have with funders, often some of the challenges that we hear are around the nature of their funding towards grantees. It may be that they're, for example, they can get very kind of specific. It may be that they're only partly funding certain roles. It may be that they're only partly funding certain projects. There may be other funders involved. So it can get quite technical and quite specific. But I think that the key point to take away from it is what Andrew was just saying around this being more important than ever. And also the fact that when we're talking to funders, what we really want to do is to figure out what could work. It's not a kind of a one-fits-all kind of blanket approach. We want to work out what would work for particular funders. And we also want to hear from funders themselves how they see their role as a champion of the living wage amongst their grantees. And we want to work out a plan of action around promoting it to their grantees, including it in their application processes, and really kind of come together to an agreement around how they see themselves as those champions and advocates of the living wage. So I think it can get quite specific, but the point is that as a team, we like to work with funders and to develop this kind of plan and to develop this kind of vision of what it is that we will achieve together.
I think that's a really useful point, Marina, and one we will certainly kind of relay to our members, that you are there to help and support and answer those questions, and that's not a reason not to become a living wage funder. There are kind of ways to deal with specific challenges that individual funders might have. So I think that's a really good point. Thank you. And Klara, do you want to come in on that? Have you kind of heard reported barriers, or sort of what are the levels of hesitancy?
I don't think, as others have already said, I don't think there is a resistance to the principle. I think sometimes our processes and sort of overthinking, the little practicalities might stand in the way. And I couldn't agree more with what Marina has just said in terms of how can we actually do it? And the first step is really, well, let's try. And let's see what comes up in those conversations. And there will be difficult conversations. As Marina has already said, sometimes, how do you deal with, if you are asking an organization, this role needs to be paid at least at the living wage rate, otherwise we can't fund you. And then you are effectively creating disparities between staff in that organization. That's a tricky situation to be in, because, you are putting the organization in a difficult position. So these are conversations to be had and to be worked through, but they're not a reason not to do it. And I think that's why, and I have to say, we've worked with Marina over the past few months for us to become a bit more proactive again, and we've got a FAQ document for grants managers to work with. So there are loads of practical tools. And again, as funders, we don't have to have all the answers. And there are organizations themselves that come up with some suggestions, and come up with suggestions around, can you actually come along and sort of challenge your peers who are not paying living wage. So I think it's more about a conversation and a partnership when we are looking, rather than thinking about how would it work within the process that we have internally designed that might then become an obstacle along the way.
Thank you, Klara. Yeah, another really good point, and kind of moving away from that mind shift of, oh, that doesn't fit with our existing way of doing things, to kind of actually what can we do to pay the living wage. We've got another question here in from Stuart, who is asking, is there any experience of implementing the real living wage with organizations mainly using sessional workers, sports coaches, etc.? So people paid specifically on hourly rates. Perhaps, yeah, Marina and Andrew, I can come to you first on that. Have you heard that through other funders, and how have you dealt with that?
What I would say, again, we have 11,000 plus organizations now who are accredited with the living wage, over 3,000 in this sector. So essentially, there's We have worked with a wide variety of pay arrangements. That's something that we can, that again, we think living wage funders can support on. And again, just to echo what was said in the last one, we will help with any, we understand every organization has a slightly different context, has a slightly different way of doing things, maybe has a slightly different setup. Whatever it is, we will support on it. And it's very likely we've worked with someone who has a very similar setup in the past and already have we can support you in managing that and really just making sure that the real living wage is, you can pay the real living wage and that it makes sense for your organization. So please do just get in touch. It's, as I say, it's almost certain that if we haven't heard of it before, somebody else in our organization has, or we've done something very similar, and we're always here to support, and we're always here to be we're here to be supportive and to really, we're not punitive, we're not here to criticize, we're here to support you in a journey towards building more effective organizations, however you want to do that.
Amazing, thank you, Andrew. And we'll, Klara, you mentioned that FAQs document as well, and we'll circulate those resources along with your presentation, Andrew. Marina or Klara, did you want to come in on that question? Like it's been answered.
Yeah, I think it's been answered by Andrew. I think we definitely have so many organizations that we work with that there will be an example somewhere in there of another organization who has a similar model, and that living wage, just to emphasize, is an hourly rate as well. So for anyone thinking about any sessional workers, any kind of workers just working specific hours, like we can work out exactly what it is, and we can definitely support employers and funders with figuring out a process to identify that.
Amazing, thank you. We're coming to an end of this second session, so I just want to say a huge thanks to all of you, and we'll be amplifying that message that you've said to us today, and circulate those resources. And it's been really useful to hear from you guys about kind of the process and why this is so important, especially right now. So huge thanks to all of you, and also those who've listened in today. We have 2 more sessions coming up this afternoon, which is focused on what funders can do to support migrants who are particularly vulnerable in this cost of living crisis, and also what funders can do to support advice services. So please do head over to our website on our events page and sign up if you're able. And thank you again, Klara, Andrew and Marina. Really good to chat to you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.